going to move along to today's specific program on immigration and faith topics. We're going to do a couple questions, and I'm going to ask you to share with a neighbor so everybody gets a chance to share. And then we're going to watch something else and do another sharing and then do the PowerPoint. So I'm asking you first to tell a neighbor about your or your family's immigrant history. Whether by slave ship or steamship, how did you or your family come to America? If you don't know, if you really have no idea, you might share how did you come to wherever you are today in the United States from somewhere else in the United States. All I know about my mother's side is they came from Kokomo, Indiana, for example.
Quite a journey.
Quite a journey to central Illinois. But tell us about your immigrant history, if you can. I'm going to ask you to take just 5 minutes for that. Just 2 or 3 people, because we want each person to have a chance to speak. Ready, set, go. Okay, we're going to listen to a story now from National Public Radio that happened to broadcast this past Monday, and it was put up on their website on Wednesday. Last week we talked about refugees, and there were questions about asylum seekers. What's the relationship? What's their experience? It's a different category of immigrant, and this story came up. But before I forget, I'm a sucker for free stuff. So when I was at the Art Institute a couple of years ago, I saw this exhibit, which is called, did anyone happen to see this exhibit at the Art Institute?
Yeah. I remember what
It's called I Strongly Believe in Our Right to Be Frivolous. That's the name of the exhibit. The artist is Munira Al-Sol. And if I remember right, she went to Syrian refugee camps in Germany, maybe also Jordan, Turkey, and so on, and then met Syrian refugees in Chicago also, heard their story, transcribed their story, but then was inspired for each person she interviewed to do a little artwork and include in Arabic the first few lines of the interview. And it was interesting to me, she used legal pad paper to emphasize how bureaucratic the experience is of people who live in refugee camps, which is something that Jim mentioned last week. But I put it up here because a couple of reasons. One is, any topic that we talk about in spiritual enrichment is suitable for art. And art is another way of getting at an issue other than using our own brains, even our heart. Art is another expressive mode, right? And also, these put a human face on this topic, which is something we'll talk about today. Immigration is not just an issue, it's people, right? So, listen now to this story from National Public Radio. It's about 7 minutes long. Who happens maybe to have already heard this story? Okay, the rest of you need to donate to public radio and listen faithfully.
It has become nearly impossible for migrants arriving at the southern border to get asylum in the U.S. The majority of cases are rejected by immigration judges. And even if these migrants do win protections in court, in some cases, they are not allowed to stay in the country. NPR's Joel Rose reports.
For a moment, Jesus thought his ordeal was coming to an end. 3 months after fleeing Venezuela, he got his chance to tell a judge how he and his mother escaped political persecution.
The
judge asked me 3 questions. What's your nationality? Why did you leave your country? Why can't you go back?
Jesus asked us not to use his last name because he wants to protect relatives who are still in Venezuela. He doesn't speak English. He didn't have a lawyer at the time. Still, he felt like the judge really understood his story.
I explained my case to him, and he accepted my experience.
The judge granted Jesus withholding of removal, a form of protection from deportation. In other words, he won, something that few migrants at the border can say these days. Jesus thought, finally, they'll let me into the U.S. where I can reunite with my family. But that's not what happened. He says the immigration officers seemed confused.
I
said to them, what's the next step? And they told me I have to go back to Mexico. I had no idea what was happening. No one explained it to me.
More than 55,000 migrants have been forced to wait in Mexico for their day in U.S. immigration court under the Trump administration program known as Remain in Mexico. It's one of several key changes that have made it extremely difficult to win asylum here. Just a tiny fraction of migrants in the program, less than 1%, have gotten protection. And sometimes even those who do win are sent back. Immigrant advocates have identified at least 17 cases. I asked Mark Morgan, the acting commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, why.
I don't think that should be happening.
I described Jesus' situation to Morgan, and he said any migrant who wins their case should be allowed into the U.S.
If that's happened the way you described that, then that's an anomaly. It's a mistake. But we'll take a look at that.
That was at a press conference last month. Last week, Customs and Border Protection got back to us and said the agency can return migrants to Mexico while officials consider whether to appeal. But immigration lawyers disagree. And in this case, officials gave Jesus paperwork saying a judge had ordered him to appear in court, which wasn't true. The paperwork also listed a hearing date in November, but that date didn't appear on any court docket because it wasn't real.
They put a fake date on a piece of paper that says you have an upcoming hearing, and there was no hearing.
Kenji Kazuka is a lawyer with the nonprofit Human Rights First. He took on Jesus' case after he'd already won in immigration court.
The fact that the commissioner doesn't even know who's being sent to Mexico under the program is really troubling. It's that kind of lack of care and attention that is putting people's lives at risk.
Customs and Border Protection denies using fake court dates. The Trump administration says it is trying to limit asylum by discouraging what it considers fraudulent claims. But Kazuka says the administration is turning away legitimate cases, too.
The Trump administration is trying to basically frighten refugees away from the United States, to make it so scary and dangerous for them to come to the border and ask for help that they just give up and go away or never come to begin with.
For Jesus, it was too dangerous to stay in Venezuela, a country that's been rocked by political upheaval. Jesus was a police officer. His superiors ordered him to arrest members of a political opposition party on bogus charges. He refused.
Empezaron persecuciones hacia mí y hacia mi familia.
They started to persecute me and my family. They killed my father. My mother was followed. She was threatened with a pistol and beatings.
Pistola y golpeada.
Jesus says he was jailed and beaten and that his father died after being refused treatment for a heart condition at a local government hospital. This is when he and his mother decided to leave.
I already lost my father and didn't want to lose my mother, so I sold all my belongings in Venezuela.
That was the beginning of a 5-month saga for Jesus and his mother. They tried to put their names on a waiting list to request asylum at a port of entry in Texas. But they say they were told repeatedly by the keepers of that list in Mexico that it was full. So they crossed illegally and turned themselves over to the Border Patrol. Jesus' mother was detained in Louisiana, but Jesus was sent back to Mexico and released.
As I was about to leave the Mexican immigration office, one of the officials told me, with the way that you look, you won't go 50 steps without being kidnapped.
Jesus was dropped off in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, where migrants are frequently targeted by cartels. He says he did witness kidnapping and violence, and even narrowly avoided being kidnapped himself. Jesus managed to escape from a group of thugs at the bus station. He was on his way to meet his lawyer, Kenji Kazuka, in person for the first time. Together, they tried once again to get Jesus into the U.S. Kazuka showed immigration authorities the judge's order granting Jesus protection in the U.S., an order that the government never appealed.
We were sent to, different officers, and they told us that Jesus was not going to be allowed into the United States. One officer told me that by going back to Mexico, his deportation had already been carried out.
Kazuka says he spent more than 4 hours arguing with officers at the border, while the staff at Human Rights First called Homeland Security in Washington, members of Congress, anyone they could think of for help. Finally, without explanation, immigration officials relented and let Jesus in. He's now in Florida, reunited with his sister and mother. They're all fighting for full asylum protections, which would give them a path to citizenship in the U.S. Jesus says he hoped this would all be easier.
Queriendo que sea un trato cálido,
I hope the treatment would be warmer and more humane, but the officials are really harsh and insulting to migrants, and the system is really complicated.
El sistema es bastante complicado.
Still, Jesus is grateful to be here. He knows a lot of people from Venezuela who are still in Mexico, waiting for their day in U.S. immigration court. Joel Rose, NPR News, Washington.
Yes, another question. And this is for sharing with your neighbor again, because I want everybody to have a chance to express themselves. Go ahead. 5 minutes. Okay. I promised you today that we would, with all that we just did, the last 30 minutes as background and context, I promised that we would delve a little bit deeper today into the foundations provided in our theological, biblical heritage in the Christian faith on this topic. I did some reading, which I enjoy, and you'll see that my reading kind of informs some of the material I'm going to present to you on the PowerPoint. The 2 books were Immigrant Neighbors Among Us, and this was a great little resource. It's pretty thin, easy to read. Every Christian tradition, except Orthodox, is represented in this little book. It goes into depth in each tradition. Methodist or Wesleyan, Reformed, Roman Catholic, Pentecostal, Evangelical, Lutheran. And it goes into depth about how that tradition informs this issue. And all the authors are Latino. This was a very fun book to read, The God Who Sees. It's part memoir and part theological biblical reflection. And the author, Karen Gonzalez, just kind of weaves it all in. It's very readable. It's a rich read. It's fun to read. I did not read, but all these books will go here because they're property of the church. They'll go here on the bookshelf if you ever want to read them. Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration in an Age of Fear by a professor at Fuller Seminary in California, in Pasadena. That's a conservative seminary. And by the way, Karen Gonzalez also comes out of a more conservative background. She works for World Relief, which is an evangelical global relief, disaster relief ministry. So, on to the points I'd like to share with you. If we have a little time for a group conversation about it, we'll do that. Since the beginning, human beings have been on the move, and their gods have been moving with them. We are all immigrants, not only as Americans, but as a species. Is that a fair statement? Of course. We all came from someplace else, or our ancestors came, originally we all came from Africa, they say. Our ancestors were travelers, and our ancestors encountered travelers. It's just part of our human experience. When I was a missionary chaplain teacher in Zimbabwe, I learned, along with my students, about the great Bantu migration, which for some reason was not taught to me in Decatur, Illinois, growing up.
I didn't have that class either.
No. But my kids in Zimbabwe learned that even their ancestors did not actually originate in Zimbabwe. They originated from West Africa, in Central Africa, and so forth, and that there was a native population in Southern Africa called the Khoisan. They existed there when Bantu Africans, black Africans, if you wish, sub-Saharan Africans, moved south. And I think for them, this really put their own sense of nationality and in a broader perspective, that they weren't just Zimbabweans, they are Africans, and that there's a lot linguistically, culturally, that ties Southern Africans to Central, East, and West Africans. In fact, Bantu languages have a lot in common with one another. It's a language family. Therefore, to be human is to be an immigrant. Therefore, at the heart of the divine human relationship is the divine immigrant relationship, if we're all immigrants. If God loves people, then God loves immigrants. Immigrants are not a subset of humanity. Immigrants are humanity. I'm trying to paint a broad brush here that might inform our conversations about this in the United States today. So, what's the basic storyline of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament?
The Exodus.
Yeah. Even before Exodus and Moses.
Abraham.
Who's that cat?
Abraham.
Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah.
Called from Ur. Do you see Ur on the far right side of the screen there in that map? So the story is in Genesis 12, God calls Abraham and Sarah to get up and go. And they go. And they settle for a while in what is today Palestine, Judea, etc. And then generation after generation, along comes Joseph. Joseph. Who winds up in Egypt, right? You know the story. Winds up in Egypt. Another Pharaoh comes along and says, I don't know Joseph. He's just another blankety blank Israelite. All the Israelites are enslaved. Along comes Moses. Moses takes them for 40 years through the Sinai, back to Canaan. But even after that, the Hebrew Bible continues with a deeper narrative of immigration, and that is the Babylonian exile, when most of the citizens of Israel in 587 BC, this is actually a historical fact, the rest is factually dubious, but there is an exile to Babylon in 587 BC, and then they are allowed back to Jerusalem in about 522. And then along come the Romans, and the Romans destroy Jerusalem, and there's a diaspora of the Jewish people. I mean, if this is God's chosen people, they better not set up household very long in one place. They're going to be on the move. But for our Jewish sisters and brothers and ancestors, the storyline is not only we were on the move, but rather God was on the move with us. And even when we didn't have a temple anymore, we took God with us into the diaspora. If God is on the move, then God has an understanding then for those who are on the move. This term preferential option is the liberation theology term that came out of the Catholic Church in 1968, meaning that God loves all people, but God has a special place in God's heart for those who are suffering, for those who are oppressed, maligned, brokenhearted, outcast, and so on. In the case of Medellin, Colombia in 1968, it was about the poor. But this theme of liberation theology is about anybody who is oppressed. In other words, God is an immigrant. What? Do you remember last year we did a segment on disablement? And the title of that book was The Disabled God. So another way of thinking about God is if God is with God's people who are essentially immigrants, then God is an immigrant. And we see God in the face and experience of the immigrant. And yet when people see the immigrant, the foreigner, the stranger, the other, sort of imagine our ancestors wherever they might be, and then over the hill comes 1, 2, 10, 20 people who don't look like us, speak like us, worship like us, act like us. Is our response, oh, good. Here's the face of God. No, it's this. Does this make sense?
Yes.
It's obviously my take on it, but I hope it's resonating with you somewhat. Fear because, so when our ancestors saw people of another ethnic group or whatever coming over the hill, what were they afraid? That they might, what?
Kill them.
I mean, ostracized.
Kill us. They might kill us. They might
Take our land,
take our land. They might
take our money.
take our money. They might,
marry our daughters.
yes, yes, dilute the purity of our race. Not racist. That's an anachronism. But John?
Oh, now I lost, sorry, I lost. Oh, when Catholics came in, people were concerned that the Pope was going to use the Catholics to get control of the United States.
Right. So that was a major issue in the 1960 election, wasn't it?
Of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. They might make us worship their God, because Lord knows it can't be the same God, but a different God. So along with fear comes all those nasty things on the right side of the screen. For the Christian, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but fear. This is not an original insight from me. Many sermons have been preached on this. At the root of what stands between us and God and a happy, healthy life is not, does God exist, but rather a primordial sense of dread about what might happen. John, if you could hold on to your question for a moment, and I hope we do have some time at the end for some more conversation. So, what does the Bible say about fear? This is the all-time best verse in the Bible about fear. Can someone read it? Greg?
There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear.
Put that on my tombstone. I like that. For Hebrew Bible legal material, it's in that handout that I sent you yesterday and is also in your hands today. The law of the stranger, what the Bible's legal codes say about the immigrants. It's a very detailed article. We don't have time to go into it. But I would offer these two verses from the Hebrew Bible. Can someone read the Exodus 1? Can you do that, please, Maggie? Maggie, did you have your hand up, Maggie?
Maggie, go.
You shall not oppress.
Which one do you want me to read?
On the first one on the left.
You shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt.
And from Leviticus, someone else, another voice. Yes, please, Flurry.
The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Pretty direct, pretty clear. And in the New Testament we have, someone read that verse from Hebrews, please. Junior?
Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it.
That's the better angels of our nature, the phrase from, is it Lincoln? This reference, by the way, is to Abraham and Sarah, who are visited by three mysterious figures who later turn out to be angels or divine representatives in Genesis. And all those instances in which Jesus treated foreigners and outsiders with kindness. Here is Jesus and the Samaritan woman by the well in John. And when he said, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Or insert immigrant or refugee or asylum seeker. Famous immigrants in the Bible. These are covered very well by Karen Gonzalez, and very entertainingly by her, especially the Syrophoenician woman. That's an awesome story. Jesus doesn't want to give her the time of day and says, well, basically, I've come from my own people. Yeah, Jesus says that. I've come from my own people. You know, I'm not here to throw crumbs to the dogs. Jesus said that. And she said, oh, but sir, you know, even the dogs are once in a while thrown a little bit from the table scraps. And his heart melts, and he makes a place for her. It's an awesome story. And Hagar also, she does a great job with Hagar, which means literally Ha-ger, the foreigner. And most famous of all, this is the concept from the lead article that I sent you by Grudy, and that is, God is on the move as in the Christian story, the most profound sense of the Christian story. God crosses the divine human barrier in Christ, who is born among us in the most humble of settings. Heaven came down to earth as a gift of love. There were, if we had more time, other things we could consider. From my readings, this theme came up a lot. The idea that the church is a pilgrim people. We Congregationalists like this language of pilgrims. We're on the move. Stanley Hauerwas and Will Willimon wrote a series of books with the understanding that Christians need to understand ourselves as resident aliens here on earth. That was the title of Stanley Hauerwas's book, Resident Aliens. We are a pilgrim people on the move. In a sense, the earth is our home. It's the only earthly home we have, but our deeper allegiance is to another place, another home, another set of values that aren't always reflected here on earth. Then you have the stewardship perspective, that the earth belongs to the Lord, every corner of it. And the moment we say, no, this is mine, it's essentially idolatry and sacrilege. And a lot of the arguments about immigration in the United States come down to, don't break the law. If it's illegal, it's wrong, it's bad, don't break the law. Karen Gonzalez, again in her article about Abraham trafficking his wife, Sarah, she addresses this issue of those who say, but immigration without documentation is illegal, and therefore, if we are law-abiding people, we must put an end to it. She puts that in a nice perspective, basically saying, as Christians have always said, there's an important place for the role of the state, an important place for the rule of law, but never, never, never is it absolute for a person of faith. There is always a higher law. Then there's an article, an editorial in the Christian Century materials I sent you about some people of faith who go to the border and put their own lives on the line, the law be damned, in order to assist asylum seekers. That's what I've got for you. And we have time to talk. Look at that.
I have to say, just one quick
Nancy?
thing. We sat next to each other and talked. We had the identical history. Ancestry. Identical.
You're related?
We're not related, but you know, it is. We sat down, well, yeah, and I am too. And it went out from there.
So I've laid a lot on you, and you've had a lot of good conversations, but what would be beneficial for our conversation these 5 minutes? John?
Your picture of the map of Africa reminded me that there's going to be, that as due to climate change, the Sahara is going to be getting bigger and bigger, and a lot of the areas that are now farmed by people who live in Africa are going to be killed. There's nothing, and those people are going to be immigrating to the north, and it's going to be a huge social issue when that starts happening.
Right. So someone asked last week, they asked Jims whether the definition of refugee in the United Nations definition includes climate refugees, and he said not yet, but he anticipates that over time it will have to, because there will be so many climate refugees. And I understand this has actually started in some places, including on at least one Aleutian island in Alaska, with a native population that is basically seeing that their island is being swallowed up by the ocean, and they have moved or are moving. I don't know if you saw this somewhere on, yeah.
They're starting in the Florida Keys as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the Chesapeake Bay.
Really? They are?
So I wonder if in our time or in our children's time, the issue of immigration will look different because of that, and yet be even more urgent.
And you know, in the next 30 years, we're going to add 1.4 billion more people to the earth. Population growth. Plus all these other things.
John, what are your thoughts?
I just wanted to add, I have a good dream life. I dream well. I once had a dream of many, many years ago, which I cannot forget. It was very vivid. I dreamt I was on a bus with my, I think it was my wife, I don't know, and we were talking to each other, and all of a sudden I realized that everybody in the bus had stopped and were looking back at us. And then I, wait a minute, they don't understand us. We're in a different culture. Oh, all of a sudden I was in a different place. I was afraid. They don't understand us, and they're looking at us like we're from another planet or something. That dream stayed with me, and I never forgot it.
So a lot of us have traveled overseas, maybe for brief times, and had that experience of being in a different culture. But imagine if you're going to live someplace in a different culture. The language is a challenge. The customs are a challenge. And imagine not wanting to do that, but having to do that because of your circumstances. I think another ethical question to ask ourselves on the immigration issue is, what would I do? What would I do if I lived in a certain place? And it was either flee or lose my life or my family's life. Because it's easy to say, well, you should stay where you are. Work it out. You know, we can't handle you here. It's another thing to look at it from the perspective of someone who's fleeing for their life. Most of us in this room have not had that experience, thank goodness. But you know, it could be any human being who's in that setting. You're probably not going to say, well, it's technically illegal, so I'm not going to do it. If it's a matter of survival for you and your family, you're probably not going to worry about the details of another country's law. Is this fair? So the example of Jesus in the NPR story, what would have happened to him if he had stayed in Venezuela?
Ironically, his name was Jesus.
Oh.
Wow.
An irony there, not lost on us. Thank you. Someone else? Yes, Lynn?
One of the things Jim said last week that hit me was how many refugees, immigrants, whatever category, really would prefer to stay in their own country, which made me think about that. And I have no answers, and it's extremely complicated. But what can we do to make the situation in their country such they don't have to?
Right.
All over the world. I'm not sure we do much of anything other than let's just keep them out. But trying to make it such that they can stay in their own culture and own country.
So let me give a quick example from my years in Zimbabwe. I lived on the eastern side of Zimbabwe, right next to the Mozambique border, and there was a civil war in Mozambique from 1975 to 1992 or 3. And that war actually sometimes kind of crept into eastern Zimbabwe where I lived. But in the Sabe Valley of Chipinge district where I lived, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees had set up a refugee camp for Mozambicans fleeing the war. And the good news is not only that the UN was there for them, but while I was in Zimbabwe, the war was ended in Mozambique. And part of the agreement between the warring sides, the government side and the anti-government side, was that those refugees would come home. And I remember sitting at Mount Selinda, which was where the mission station was, and there's just one road through Mount Selinda to the border at Xilungabera in Mozambique, and watching bus after bus painted with that light blue United Nations color with the UN flag on the side, going back from Zimbabwe to Mozambique. So it was encouraging that sometimes the international system works.
Was the United Nations involved in the settlement of the Civil War?
I don't recall, but all nations of the world can work together when there's a civil war in a nation, right, to help bring about peace. Often that's not done by one country, but by countries working with others in a multilateral situation. So, I mean, that's one kind of approach, is when war is the issue. The nations of the world should probably not turn away, but use our diplomatic and other means to end that war. In Central America, let's bring it to what's bringing people to this country right now at the border. Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala are a mess.
Venezuela.
Yes, Venezuela is really a bad situation. There's corruption, there's civil unrest. I wonder how strong the central governments even are in those Central American countries. But there's a lot of repression in Venezuela. And corruption too. So it would be an interesting turn of U.S. foreign policy to move from protecting the borders, as you're suggesting, Lynn, to becoming a force, a stronger force for good in those countries to bring about an end to the gangs, the drug trade, and so on. How do you do that, though, when other countries are sovereign? We have the sovereign nation-state system. But with carrots and sticks, there are ways.
We
Right?
could use the UN as the richest, most powerful country in the world. And as American Christians, kind of ironic, this comes up quite a bit, right? That we are this patchwork quilt or this melting pot, a young country, all of immigrants, except for natives, of course. Why are we the most nativist place in the world? We're all immigrants, recent immigrants. So
it is an irony. I hope that this presentation and our conversation today was helpful for you. Next week, we have a panel of immigrants who are going to help us understand that this from a very personal perspective.
From where?
Well, they are actually people that those of us at Winnetka Congregational Church know. It's Andrew Osafu, who is a participant in this circle. He's from Ghana, not here today. And then we have Waldek Zelkowski, who is on our staff. He emigrated as a Roman Catholic priest from Poland many years ago and is our publisher here at WCC. If I find another person for the panel, fine. If not, it'll be just nice to hear their stories too.
Wow.
Jeffrey?
Nancy.
Could you maybe have a program on solutions? And we all have our, I mean, I have my crazy ideas that are so naive, but solutions to this whole thing?
So actually our Sunday morning programs through May are already planned out. But we can always think about that for the future. Yeah, right. And it depends on who you ask.
Yes.
The country is divided. Surprise, surprise on this. But I bet there are common sense, moderate, middle of the road, take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Is that possible?
Compromise?
They exist. Would they actually have a hair's chance of passing Congress, that's another issue. Thank you all. Go in peace.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Yep. Mel and JS, thank you for being part of our conversation.